Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. Claire Wasserman here, founder and author of Ladies Get Paid. We are an educational platform, global community, and of course, a book all about helping women earn more and live better. And as part of that, I love to invite other women on for interesting conversations with me about how they are also kind of furthering that mission of supporting women in their financial, professional, and mental health journeys. And so today we actually have a journalist and author with us, Josie Cox. And she, well, you'll hear in just a second, has a very nice accent. She has worked for places like the BBC, Reuters, Wall Street Journal, and The Independent, where she served as the business editor. But most interestingly, most recently, she is the author of a forthcoming book called Women, Money, Power. I think besides my book, Ladies Get Paid, it has the best title I've seen yet out there, which is a narrative history of female economic empowerment. And today we're going to be talking about what she learned in doing the research of the history of female economic empowerment and really how entrenched systemic inequities, they're there, but what can we do as individuals to play a role in dismantling them? Also, as those of you who may be following along with these various LinkedIn lives that I host, I have construction happening outside my window. So apologies if you can hear that annoying sound. I'm about to go on mute. So I turn it over to Josie. Josie, thank you so much for being here. I would love for you to talk maybe first a little bit about your own career path and what led you to want to write not only a book, but specifically this book.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Claire. It's such a pleasure to be here. I love talking about my book, of course, because what author doesn't like talking about their book? But yes, I'll give a little bit of background on who I am and why my accent sounds weird. So I am, as Claire said, a journalist, an author, broadcaster. I started my career way back when, actually, in Germany. So I'm originally from Switzerland. I grew up speaking German, but my mother is from Eastern Europe. My father is British, so he gave me this accent. Thank you, Daddy. Grew up in Switzerland, ended up doing undergrad in the UK. And then after undergrad, I graduated straight after the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, which was a delightful time to graduate, especially into an industry like media, which is so resilient during times of crisis. And the only job that I could get, and it was a fabulous job, I should say, was a markets correspondent in Frankfurt in Germany. It was a very, very busy beat at that time. I knew absolutely nothing about the economy. I knew nothing about markets. But, beggars can't be choosers. So I hauled myself out to Frankfurt, kind of loved the city, actually, in the end, and started writing about financial markets. I bought myself a subscription to the FT, to The Economist. I bought all of Michael Lewis's books. I read those. I taught myself what a bond was, what an equity is, and started writing about markets. And I ended up being out there for a few years. I then transferred to London, wrote about debt for Reuters for a little while, and then got hired by the Wall Street Journal. So I worked as a markets correspondent for the Wall Street Journal out in London, again for a few years before moving over to The Independent, which is a pretty international publication based in London, as their business editor. And it was around that time, I'd been covering sort of hard sort of business and economics news up until that point. But the one big change that was happening in the UK at that time was that there was a debate going on around implementing gender pay gap reporting mandates in the UK. And those came in 2017, right at the time when I was business editor. And essentially what they meant was that every company in the UK employing at least 250 people had to publish their gender pay gap annually. So every year they had to put out this report where they essentially broke down their gender pay gap by quartile, so lowest paid to highest paid quartile in their workforce. And it was absolutely astonishing because for me, it was the first time that there was all this data available, essentially laying out this problem that I had suspected and anecdotally knew was around, and that I had sort of come up against firsthand as a woman reporting about a very male-dominated industry. And so I sort of threw myself into this data. I kind of became obsessed with the gender pay gap reporting process, with the companies that were complying with the letter of the law, but not necessarily the spirit of the law. And I wrote a whole bunch of pieces around that. The other thing that happened at that time was that I became a mom. And so a lot of these things that I was theoretically writing about, so what happens when women leave the workforce to start a family, when they go on maternity leave, what kind of impact that might have on their professional careers, on their economic empowerment, on their ability to work outside the home, I was feeling firsthand, and it was quite jarring. And it was actually also at that time where I made a decision to go freelance for various reasons. My husband's job was very demanding. It was a conversation the two of us had. Anyway, I went freelance, and that really gave me this really amazing opportunity to sort of delve very much deeper into this topic of inequality in the workforce from the perspective of a markets reporter, right? As someone who kind of grew up in this very sort of quantitative world. And then in 2020, we relocated to New York from London. We'd both lived in London about 10 years by this point. And I had this wonderful opportunity to go back to school, which was fabulous. I was offered this fellowship at Columbia Journalism School. It's a reporting fellowship for business and economics reporters, essentially allowing them to go back to school for 1 year for free, which is lovely, and to just explore sort of the complexities of economic reporting, of market reporting, to kind of, I guess, like fill in those blind spots that you might have had as a reporter writing about these topics. And what I really used that year to do was to take a step back from the sort of day-to-day grind of being a reporter, of churning out the news, of also being like a mom, right? And just having that headspace to be like, what do I want to do next? And for years and years, I realized there had been this book in my head that was sort of like germinating, and that I wanted to do. And I wanted to write about the gender pay gap, and I wanted to take time to investigate why the hell the gender pay gap in the US is still at 82 cents to the dollar for women versus men. Why have we not made more progress? Why are we where we are? What are the constructs of capitalism that are preventing us from making that same kind of trajectory of progress that we saw in the 70s and 80s? And so I had this wonderful opportunity to spend some time during that year putting together this book proposal. It kind of started out as this sort of like anatomy of the gender pay gap. I wanted to write about the whole world. My professors at the journalism school and at the business school where I was taking some classes were like, you can't write about the whole world. That's crazy. You'll write a whole library. So I limited it to the country in which I am in, which is the US. And I set out writing this proposal. I finished up the proposal in May 2021 and was very fortunate to be offered a book deal later that year in the summer. So have spent 3-ish years working on this thing, and it has finally become available for pre-order. It is officially launching on the 5th of March next year, just in time for International Women's Day and during Women's History Month. And I'm so excited to share it with everybody.
Yes, I'm so, as a fellow author, but also in this world, in this sphere, I feel like our two books complement each other really, really well. I'm so glad that you wrote it. Quick question for you. This is, I love asking this question, which is, you set out to do something, right? You had the idea, pretty good sense of what you might uncover, but what surprised you in whether it was in the research that you did or even about yourself in your whole process?
So many things. Yeah. Turns out book writing is quite hard. Who knew? Right.
I don't recommend it. Don't start businesses. Don't write books.
Oh no, I'm going to write another one. But
I know, and that's part of the problem too, because you go through it and you're like, ooh, I could do it better next time. Like now I know how this works. So
totally. Yeah. Okay. But what surprised me? Okay. So many things, but one thing that I think is so telling, and an anecdote that I always tend to share with people when they ask me, you know, how this all started and what really was the like surprising thing that shocked you into action when I actually like sat down and put pen to paper. And that was actually a conversation that I had at the height of the pandemic. It was just before I sort of like sat down and made a concerted effort to pull this proposal together. And it was an off the record interview that I did with a very, very prominent CEO of a very large corporation in this country. And he's very well known. He's a household name. It was an off the record conversation, so I'll never say who it was. But I had the opportunity to ask him some questions, and I sat down and I said to him, you know, I appreciate that you are aware of inequality in the workforce, including in your workforce. And I know that you are making efforts to get more women into senior management, that you are making efforts to rectify the gender pay gap that is still so persistent. And nonetheless, I said to him, I realize that based on your gender pay gap reports that you have to file for your UK subsidiaries of your company, I can tell that the pay gap is still very large. And most importantly, over the last 3 years, which was the amount of data that we had at that point, your gender pay gap hasn't moved. And I said to him, why is that? You know, and it wasn't a hardball question. I was genuinely interested in what his view was on where the holdup was and what systemic things were in place that had prevented it from closing. And he said to me that I had to understand that sometimes when a woman is in a job and when she decides to start a family and when she leaves the paid labor market to take a maternity leave, however brief, when she comes back, she's sometimes not as professionally ambitious as she was. Oh. And Claire, the face that you're making right now was the inside face that I was making then. Yeah. Because I had this whole like onslaught of emotions in reaction to this. I was horrified, of course, but I was also really sad, you know, that either it was actual ignorance or it was feigned ignorance. But either way, this person was unable to provide an answer that was credible, that was respectful, that was rooted in reality, right? And to acknowledge the fact that inequality in the workforce, and the gender pay gap is obviously just one very crude gauge of that, inequality in the workforce is not a women's problem, right? It is, the onus cannot be on women to fix themselves, to lean in, to do all the heavy lifting in order to make sure that they're treated the same way as men. That is not happening. It's impossible. And it is absolutely wrong to demand that of women. And yet the sentiment of his answer was so shocking and so enlightening that I was like, the first issue we need to address here is ignorance, misunderstanding around the root cause of inequality in the workforce between the genders. And so that was the biggest shock that I had initially. And then as I kind of jumped into the reporting, and I should say at this point that the book is a chronology. So it starts in the 1940s. It's very narrative driven. I tell the tales of women through the ages who have contributed to female economic empowerment in some meaningful way, but whose efforts are often not widely recognized. These women are not household names. They're not prominently featured in history books or on history syllabuses. And I start with kind of the Rosie the Riveters of World War II and how they came into the workforce for the first time in a big way, and then all the way through to the present day. And as I was researching and as I was writing, there was this really steady trajectory from the 40s, the 50s, in the 60s, in 1960, the FDA introduced the oral contraceptive pill for the first time, which was absolutely revolutionary for women in the workforce, being able to plan their careers, being able to time their careers. And then in the 70s, we had this whole slate of laws and Supreme Court decisions that came in that enabled women to be in the labor market, to not get fired for getting pregnant. Wild, isn't it? To not get paid a different amount for doing the same work as a man. All these really kind of like landmark pieces of legislation that came in that fueled progress. Then we get into the 80s and 90s, and it's like, oh, like something's stalling. And the piece that is missing and that starts to become a real problem is culture, right? And it's sort of like women are coming into senior leadership positions in companies for the first time. And we start seeing this kind of like backlash against female leaders. And there's a chapter in the book that I call the bitch or the bimbo, a bimbo or a bitch. And that's kind of it. It's sort of this narrative around female leadership became very ugly. And there was a sense of kind of upsetting the status quo of the historical status quo. And so what we saw in terms of, you know, both the gender pay gap and other gaps that measure inequality between the genders was the real stalling and almost like an inflection point. And that was so shocking for me, because initially when I set out to write this, I thought we're going to see this like nice, steady trajectory towards progress that might have stalled a little bit in the last kind of 5 years, but certainly not like way back in the 80s and 90s. So that was really, really shocking and very humbling for me.
Mhm. Yeah. I guess one response to that guy would have been, thank you for your honesty. There, besides F you, but like, I
Hmm.
so appreciate when people say out loud the thing that
Hmm.
we're assuming they're thinking. Like,
Yeah,
that must be how you really feel. You've confirmed it.
yeah, yeah.
Question. Yeah. So I realized we didn't sort of describe the book
Mm.
to start out with, which we probably should have done. You gave a good sense of it in terms of what you cover and the structure of it. But is there anything else you want to let people know about what the book is about? Otherwise, I'd say maybe let's jump into a story, one of your favorites that
Yeah.
really kind of illustrates, I guess, hope, maybe.
Yeah, so the just in terms of the structure, a little bit more on that. So as mentioned, it is a chronology. It's very narrative driven. Every chapter is kind of broadly a decade, either telling the stories of some of the women during that decade or during that time period that affected huge change, be that political change or legislative change or economic change, or who were the protagonists in a really important court case. I'm thinking of like Lily Ledbetter or people like that. So I profile them. So it is in every sense, the book is a celebration of unsung heroes.
Mhm.
But at the same time, it is very much, and I hope this comes across, a critique of the current system and a critique of why we're not further along and what role biases and heuristics still play, and this lack of awareness that I'm talking about, and the inadequate policies that still prevent women from reaching their full professional and economic potential. So it's sort of, the goal of it is kind of twofold. I do want to, I want it to be a platform for these women who have not been recognized adequately through history. But I also want it to be like a real wake up call. And I said from the get go that, it's called Women, Money, Power. It has this like nice pink color on the cover, which is funny. When I was initially talking to the designer, I was like, I don't want any pink on the cover, and now
Mhm.
pink, but I've been reassured that this is actually fuchsia, not pink. So
Yeah.
like that, right? Fuchsia.
Yes.
Anyway, so it could be, it could be construed as like a book about women by a woman for women, but it is not. It is a book that is for everybody. And I really, really hope that this gentleman who I described in my previous story has the time and the energy to pick up a copy and read.
Fabulous. Um, I do want to hear, maybe we'll end with an inspirational story from the book, but let's give people the tools. So, in your opinion, what can an individual do to increase economic empowerment, whether for themselves or the people around them, right? It's like
Hmm.
policy change is what's really required, but in order
Yeah,
to get there, that means time and patience, right?
yeah,
Which we don't have, or I don't have.
yeah.
So,
Oh, I think you've just muted.
thank
There she
you. I'm
is.
curious, yeah, if you have anything for the individual who's feeling their blood boiling when they heard that story about the man saying, well, women who return to the workforce after having kids are less ambitious, right? Like,
Yeah.
what do you do with that information?
Yeah, yeah. So I think, this overarching question of like, what can we do is everywhere. And I wish I could answer it. And of course, there are things, as you say, policy is super important. I think parental leave in this country is just like, I mean, inadequate feels like an inadequate word. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's tragic. It's a tragedy. And there are plenty of international examples that prove, how it could be different. So policies, of course, we have to call out bias. We have to call out heuristics. We have to call out all these kind of natural tendencies that have in the past created barriers. But I think sort of like the overarching message that I want to bring home with this book is that we have to have conversations that are rooted in respect and that are set out to meet somebody where the shared values lie, right? And I talk about this in one of the latter chapters in the book. The argument I make throughout the book is that access to reproductive healthcare and reproductive rights are so tightly entwined with economic freedom and female economic empowerment. And so inevitably, the topic of abortion and the overturn of Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs decision feature very centrally in the book. But I also acknowledge in the book that these are topics that are extremely divisive and that people feel very entrenched in their own beliefs about. And so when we have conversations, when we try and raise awareness, when we try and educate people around what could actually help women to become more economically empowered, we have to have conversations that are where we try and see both sides of an argument.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been very challenging for me because, especially against the backdrop of some of the things that are happening in this country, I just want to like scream from the rooftops, and I just want to swear and be angry and aggressively speak my mind. But at the end of the day, that isn't necessarily going to change somebody's mind. I think sitting down, explaining your perspective, and having a conversation that, as I say, is rooted in respect and is rooted in common values is going to be the way to address these problems.
Mm-hmm. By the way, anybody who's watching who has a question, or if this is resonating, feel free to comment. Do you have any examples of how that might actually be expressed? Like whether you've seen it in your research, in your own life, or in an ideal world, like what that would actually look like?
Yeah. So one of the most, I guess, powerful interviews and most kind of impactful interviews that I did during the book research process was with this amazing lady named Ashley All, who is a strategic communications professional. She has worked in politics, she's worked in policy, she's based in Kansas, and she took a leadership role in the campaign to try and get abortion enshrined in the Kansas Constitution last year. And the vote took place in August. It happened shortly after after the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade. And against all odds, I can say she managed to succeed in this decision, and the vote came in favor of Kansas enshrining the right to abortion in the Constitution, which was so significant. I mean, I didn't actually appreciate until I started researching for the book how sort of rich the history of the anti-abortion movement was in Kansas and is in Kansas. Kansas at the time also was a state where registered Republicans outnumbered registered Democrats by 2-1. Wow. And it was almost unthinkable at times that abortion would really be a constitutional right in Kansas. And yet Ashley was one of these people, and is one of these people, who has this amazing ability to connect to people and to meet them where they're at and to hear them and to listen and to tap into those common values. And she was such an inspiration to me. And I think that her story is, I think it would be too reductive to say, if it can happen in Kansas, it can happen anywhere. But I think that if she's illustrated to us that what you can achieve if you find that humanity in a person, and if you meet them where they're at, and if you're patient as well,
Mm-hmm. Right. It's such a balance of both patience, but also pushiness.
Yeah.
Action and speaking up, but also listening. I find the nuance. I mean, it's like you have to hold all of these seemingly contradictory things at once together.
Yeah.
What would you say are some other elements in, common threads throughout the stories that you profile of these women who are fighting for economic empowerment?
Yeah. It's such an interesting question because the women who I profile are so diverse, like starting with, the Rosie the Riveters. And I actually, one of the characters who is sort of the main subject in my first chapter is this lady named May, who is absolutely phenomenal. She's alive. She's 97 years old. And during the Second World War, she built aircraft at Boeing in Seattle. As a 16-year-old, she was like going into the wings of the aircraft and riveting. And she's so incredible. And she's so sharp. And she was so happy to tell her story and to share her passions with me and to get angry with me and tell me what she's annoyed about and all of these things. So she's one example. And then, so many other people. One of the characters is the lady who essentially provided all the funding for the research and development into the first contraceptive pill, which when you read the story, you realize it's just like against all odds that this happened. It was at a time when reproductive rights and abortion were just so stigmatized in the US, and the Comstock laws were still very much had a hold on the country, and yet she persevered. And like her and May, the Rosie the Riveter, who I've become good friends with now, they all ask the question, why not? In a world in which women are told to do certain things and not other things, they all ask the question of, why can't it be another way? Why can't a woman go and build an aircraft? Why can't a woman have a profession in the paid labor market when previously she would have been expected to stay in the home and raise the kids? Why can't a man stay in the home and raise the kids? And the pioneer of the birth control pill, who I was just talking about, she was so visionary in the sense that she asked, why do women have to get pregnant when they have sex? Why can't we separate that privilege from that duty, in a way, I guess, if you can say it as crassly as that? Why can't there be some kind of magic pill that women can take that enable them to take control over their own contraception? And it's just this kind of this visionary quality, this ability to think outside the box. There's an amazing woman who I profile in the book, who is little known, in my opinion, named Pauli Murray, who was a legal scholar. She was absolutely remarkable. She was probably gender fluid, though we didn't have the terminology at that time to describe it as such. But she became friends with Eleanor Roosevelt. She was challenging all the policies at the time around why certain colleges didn't admit women. She actually trained Ruth Bader Ginsburg at a white shoe law firm in the US, and yet she's basically written out of history. She's so remarkable. And she also was one of these people who asked, why not? Why does it have to be this way? Why can only men study at this college? Why can only white people study at this college? Why do we have to do that? Yeah. So that persistence, I think, is probably the uniting quality that I see in these characters.
Yeah. Like a genuine curiosity. Like why and why not? Question about, it's interesting when I read the subtitle here, right? So the rise and fall of economic equality seems to imply that we were doing well at some point, right? Yeah. Things were moving up and then they went down. Is that true? If so, when and how and what happened? Or is it more of a roller coaster sometimes, because progress is not linear. Like, well, it goes up, it goes, it's like you take one step forward and 2 steps backwards. Yeah. So talk to me, about the choice of that subtitle.
Yeah, so the choice of that subtitle is definitely reflective of what I was talking about earlier, and that kind of inflection point that we faced kind of around the late 80s, 90s, when a lot of legal change had come into effect. And I describe it in the book as kind of like the low-hanging fruit, like these laws that prevented, outright discrimination, overt sexism, things like that. And then the fall is kind of like where we've faltered, where we have faced these challenges around culture, around the characterization of women in the workforce, around the fact that we're still battling stereotypes unsuccessfully, around the fact that we are still reverting to narratives that are essentially akin to like this lean in idea of putting the onus on women to fix the problem. And so to me, that is a fall. I don't think it's necessarily something that's not reversible. Like, I think you're right in saying that it is a roller coaster, right? Ups and downs. But I just think that it's so important to appreciate that inflection point and the fact that the trajectory has not been linear and that we really, really need to do something to turn things around.
Yeah. In our final minute, any final words of wisdom or hope that you can give people? And then, of course, you'll share where people can connect with you and purchase the book.
Yeah, I mean, my hope is just that this book is part of a broader conversation. One thing I really want to do, and I say this in the prologue, is acknowledge the fact that I am just one writer from one particular background, giving my perspective on a very, very complex systemic interplay of issues and problems. And I will never be able to know what it's like to be a single Black mom in the South who is battling economic inequality. I will never be able to know that, but I can appreciate the limits of my own knowledge and the limits of my own experiences. And through that all, I just hope that this is sort of one book in hopefully a very, very large body of literature that eventually gets published and becomes available so that we can start having these really meaningful conversations.
I love it. And hey, maybe a movie will be made out of one of or many of these fantastic characters that it sounds like you really...
Yeah, maybe you can star in it, Claire.
Oh, well, sure. Yeah. Let's talk. Actually, that's another question I wanted to ask as we close up. How did you decide what characters to include and what who not to include?
Honestly, I wake up at 2 a.m. now and I'm like, oh my goodness, I should have written this person into chapter 2. Like, that's why I'm saying I'm going to write another book, because there were so many that it was just an almost impossible task. And I still feel guilty for not including certain people.
Listen, you can turn that into podcast content, LinkedIn posts.
Yep.
Like, you could be sharing them now, and that can help promote.
Yeah, I do have a Substack, so I pay tribute to some of those on my Substack.
Good. Promote it. Tell us where to find you, follow you, and pay you if we can.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, I would love any pre-orders that I can get for the book. As I say, it's out on March 5th, but it's available to pre-order from any major retailer, independent bookstores, larger bookstores. You can get it anywhere as of now.
Fabulous. And for everybody watching, not on the Ladies Get Paid LinkedIn, come on over, because Josie's going to be posting underneath this recording those links to connect with her and to pre-order the book. And beyond that, come join Ladies Get Paid, ladiesgetpaid.com or ladiesgetpaid.com/subscribe. We have a newsletter where we share invites to events, most and many of them free, as well as we have a new salary negotiation video course coming out. So talk about, economic empowerment. That to me is the pretty much only way you can change your own circumstance quickly, or as quickly as possible. It's by asking for a raise. I'm Claire Wasserman. Find me on LinkedIn. You can also find me on Instagram at Claire Gets Paid. Josie Cox, thank you so very much for being here today, and of course the work that you do. And I can't wait to dive into the book. Best of luck.
Thank you so much for having me, Claire.
Okay, now go get paid.